is the other day, Gary Vee tweeted about a Michael Jordan card, and I was just pulling up the tweet. If you see me looking over here, I have my computer. I don't exactly have a setup yet, so like I have a desk over there, and I have I'm actually just sitting in my room, and I don't really have a setup that's good for kind of doing the podcast and all, or at least the video side. So we're learning here. We're learning together. So Gary Vee tweets. He said, the days of buying Jordan rookies at PSA 9, PSA 8, and PSA 10 levels are about to be over for the majority. The education of the supply of this card is in full tilt. So essentially what he's saying is that some of these vintage and older cards are just going to be bought up and they're going to be put into safety deposit boxes. And he has a couple follow-up tweets, and one person kind of made that point, and he said, yes, that's very true. And Kobe was another player that he talked about, and Jordan. And just, well, so vintage I think is also an interesting term, because some people, like myself, I just use vintage as like old. I call old cards vintage, which if you go to PSA's website, vintage is anything from 1970 and older, and then I forget what their second one, but then they have modern, which is I think it's 1985 to 2016, and then ultra modern is 2016 and forward. So, like I said, I use vintage as more of a general term. I think if you are more specific about what vintage is, it isn't, the Jordan wouldn't necessarily be a vintage card. It's not. It wouldn't be categorized as vintage, at least from PSA. But so essentially what he's saying is, I mean, you could lump all of them in together, but whatever, we'll continue. A lot of these older cards, they just don't have high print runs, or not high print, they don't have high populations of PSA 10s, and even PSA 9s and PSA 8s, some of the older cards. You saw it, I mean, the Wayne Gretzky PSA 10 O-Pee-Chee sold for $1.2 million. That card, there's only 2 PSA 10s in existence of that card. And then you look at the tops, and there's only 2 of those, and that one sold for around 700,000. So what essentially Gary is saying is that either you should be buying more vintage and holding on to it, which is something that I have said that I think is a very good strategy, like flipping modern stuff to make money and then putting it into investments. Because I don't think Shaq and Kobe are vintage, but like I think they're in the same sort of category where they were such superstars when they were at their peaks that I think if you look at their cards, they're going to be in that same sort of conversation. Now, they have a lot more. They're going to have a lot more population too. That's kind of the other thing, because they were in that peak moment for sports cards in the 90s where all these companies were making cards, and all the companies were printing millions of cards every year, and it was just crazy. So Kobe and Shaq I would also put into that kind of conversation, but I would be looking for lower population, because something that I've talked about I'll use Kobe and Shaq as an example. Something I've talked about with their cards, with there being so many of them, is you want to look into at least this is my opinion, and we'll see how this goes in the future, but you want to look into the sets and the brands that are around nowadays. So that's why I like Topps and Upper Deck for the Shaq, and then Topps for the Kobe, but I also like the Topps Shaq as well. So you want to look into those sets, because at least I think that the name brand and the brand that's still around today, I think is going to be easier for people to understand, where if they're looking at like a Fleer card or any of the other, I guess Beam Team Stadium Club is another one that I think is kind of interesting. But like if you look at any of the brands that were around back then that aren't around now, I think people are going to look at that and they're going to be confused, because they're not going to understand why the Topps one is so much more than one of these other brands that isn't around anymore. And he even talks about on Twitter, so Gary talked about on Twitter, where people have reached out to him privately and said that they're buying up a lot of this vintage stuff and they're not talking about it publicly, which, I'm going to take him at his word that that's obviously true. I think it was inevitable, as modern continues to increase in every single set, increase in population, increase in print run. I think it was inevitable that something like this was going to happen, where you're going to see probably less and less cards sell, because we did see a PSA 10 Jordan actually break the record sell through Golden Auction and sold for over $222,000, breaking the previous record. And that's where I think, I'm not sure, because I think before, like roughly, I've heard House of Jordans talk about this, and they said that they would roughly see between, I think, 3 to 5 Jordans sell every month, and I think we're going to start to see that number go down, and even maybe the PSA 9s and PSA 8s, I think we're going to start to see go down as well, just because, like Gary said, and like something that I think is that people are buying these cards, and they are more buying them as long-term investments and not as flipping opportunities. And people are just going to buy them, and they're not even going to sell them in the next 5 years. They're going to be waiting 10, 15 years to sell some of these cards. And people are going to buy them. We're just never going to see that card sell really in the future, or at least in the near future. We're not going to see people buying, because if you look at the Jordan last year around this time was probably about $40,000 now. The Jordan documentary also had a pretty significant portion of reason, or had a significant reason for the change in that price and why it did go up a little bit. But still, I think that card eventually is, I don't know, I don't see why it can't be $1 million. Like, that's sort of crazy to say. Maybe a more realistic number is going to be in the $700,000-$800,000 range, because like I said, there is 300 of them. So it's not like the Wayne Gretzky card where there's only one, which is why I think that the Wayne Gretzky card actually was a phenomenal deal, because if you're comparing it to the Jordan card, there is only, there's less than 1% of the PSA 10 O-Pg compared to the 86 Fleer Jordans. So I think looking at those numbers and comparing them, that's why I saw that the Gretzky card actually is such a way better deal than maybe buying one of these Jordan cards. But, obviously, if you had the chance to sell a card for $1 million, how